Hello again. This will be my second video reviewing a video from Leather Apron Club. I've done one in the past covering his Jews Are Overrepresented in Tim Pool podcasts, so can check that out if you want. In this video, I won't be necessarily critiquing everything he said. In fact, I would say like the first part of his video is more or less accurate. He seemed to provide all of the info and data that, to my mind, proves that Qatar isn't this like super nebulous country with like a bunch of foreign influence. I think his point that Qatar has spent billions on college like campuses makes sense if you just like look at the construction of those same campuses in Qatar itself. Like, I mean, you can just watch his video. It makes sense to me, so I'm not going to nitpick that. Maybe someone could, but I kind of don't see the point. I do think it's pretty obvious, and I've said this before and have written a Substack article on this, that other Middle Eastern countries, let alone Israel, but like Saudi Arabia and UAE have a lot of influence in the US, and obviously Israeli influence is something he's going to talk about, which I'll engage with. But yeah, I would say traditionally, if we're going to go with like a Gulf state Arab Muslim country that has had more influence in our internal affairs, it was definitely Saudi Arabia with the UAE, and then probably Qatar after that. So I won't be going too much into that aspect of his video, and more just focusing on some of his comparisons with Israel, Jewish influence, and whatever else I can find that's interesting. Okay, so I'll just get into it. First, we're going to start with his comparison between pro-Palestinian and in his words, Israeli groups on college campuses.
While organizations like the ISGAP villainize pro-Palestine groups like SJP, that is, Students for Justice in Palestine, the fact that they ignore discussion of the various pro-Israel groups on campus can give a skewed perspective as to the real state of play. That's because these pro-Israel groups are absolute Goliaths as compared to the pro-Palestine groups by every metric, including size, number of different groups, and funding. To establish a point of comparison, let's look at SJP, which is by far the largest pro-Palestine on-campus group. They claim to operate 350 chapters, with an undisclosed number of members, but which probably ranges from a few thousand to as high as 10,000, given what we know about their average chapter size. In terms of funding, this is undisclosed, but the ISGAP reported in 2024 that SJP's parent organization, National Students for Justice in Palestine, or NSJP, received $3 million in funding. While NSJP works with several different pro-Palestine groups, SJP is by far the largest. So for simplicity, let's just assume the worst case scenario and say that SJP received $3 million a year in funding. Now let's compare this to the various pro-Israel and pro-Jewish groups which operate on US campuses. Hillel International operates on 956 campuses according to their website and serves over 180,000 Jewish students, funding $185 million a year. Chabad on campus. Their website claims they operate on 950 campuses worldwide and serve over 150,000 students, funding $16 million a year.
Okay, stopping here, he points to Hillel and Chabad as like pro-Israel groups. He says later, like, yeah, I know that they are just pro-Jewish in general, but they are also the like Jewish groups that have like focused on Israel and like focused on being anti-Palestinian or whatever. I mean, I'm sure like some of those chapters have done stuff like that, but this is like really bizarre that he doesn't bring up Muslim student associations on campus. Like, anyone who's been to a college campus has seen those. According to their website, which is just like one Muslim student association website, like the main one, but there's like other smaller groups, just like there's other smaller Jewish groups. If you look at the Excel data from the map, you find that there's like over 600 chapters in the US. And like if you go on certain websites that he probably thinks are just like Zio-pilled or whatever, there's, you know, articles written about MSAs having like controversial characters and like being associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. I'm not even like making a big deal about that, but like clearly the MSAs on campuses are pro-Palestine. They talk about Palestine. You can see it here. So I don't know why he doesn't bring this up, because it's like the obviously like the biggest comparison to Hillel and Chabad.
Israel On Campus Coalition, an organization which promotes Israel on U.S. college campuses and attempts to coordinate between the various pro-Jewish campus groups across the country. Funding, $25 million. American Jewish Committee combats anti-Semitism on campus. Funding, $88 million.
Just for the record, the AJC is not primarily a college-oriented thing and has like a pretty long history. It has done stuff on college campuses, but if he wants to go down that route, then a lot of like Islamic affiliated advocacy groups have done the same, which aren't only focused on college campuses, which I'll get into later.
And With Us, an organization that hosts educational programs on at least several hundred campuses on pro-Israel and Zionist topics. Funding, $27 million. And Hasbara Fellowships, funding $1.7 million yearly. And these are merely the organizations that I decided to look up funding figures for. There are so many more, including Jewish on Campus, Jewish National Fund's Campus Resource Fund, Students Supporting Israel, Club Z, guess what the Z stands for, and Jew Hatred, Mothers Against College Anti-Semitism, Alums for College Fairness, the David Project, now part of Hillel, the Maccabee Task Force, and J Street U. I could go on like this for a good 20 minutes or so and not even touch upon every explicitly pro-Jewish and or pro-Zionist organization operating on campuses. And this doesn't include groups like the ADL, who focus on campus anti-Semitism, but not primarily.
So he brings up the ADL, which I would compare with the AJC actually as kind of just like a generic, like defending Jewish people, Jewish rights, whatever kind of organization. But there are clearly Muslim and Arab groups like this as well in the United States. So I don't know why he doesn't mention them. The most prominent one is CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations. That has had like a very checkered and controversial past. It's pretty well known and obviously does stuff on college campuses as well. And a 2024 report of just like publicly stated funds, they had $8 million in contributions. I don't even see the point really in like going over all of these like nonprofits and groups and like how much money they raised. Like honestly, when you get to like the millions or tens of millions of dollars, it's really not that much. He'll talk later on about like the stuff more in like the hundreds of billions of dollars, but you know, every nonprofit organization with any clout has millions of dollars. That's just like kind of how it is. There's also the Arab Anti-Discrimination League, which is basically just the ADL but for Arabs. And just going back to Muslims more broadly, there's the Muslim Legal Fund of America, and they've done work defending the rights of students at like college protests and stuff for Palestine. I'm not making like a judgment call on any of these organizations. I'm just saying for all the Jewish ones, there's an Arab or Muslim equivalent, and there's more Muslim ones I can mention, just like he can mention more Jewish ones. I don't really see like the point of this. If he's gonna mention like a bunch of Jewish organizations, then you could do the same for the Arab Muslim ones. I'll just throw in some images and sources here for that, but anyway, moving on.
Groups which are inherently pro-Jewish, like Jewish fraternities.
There are obviously Muslim fraternities as well.
Nor does it include the literally thousands of pro-Jewish groups which are specific to one campus only, which promote Jewish and Israeli political causes.
I mean, he just uses a picture of some small group called Aggies for Israel, which is like from UC Davis, a pro-Israel group on campus. I mean, who cares? There's pro-Palestinian groups at UC Davis as well. And I guarantee you any University of California college is going to be more pro-Palestine generally than pro-Israel, like at least student-wise.
And yes, there are of course other pro-Palestine groups besides SJP and the others I've mentioned, but they all are minuscule compared to the pro-Israel and pro-Jewish groups. Here's a quick spreadsheet I made detailing the differences. Looking at the top 6 pro-Palestine and the top...
I've already explained why this is misleading. He's being selective with which pro-Palestine groups he's using and being very generic with the pro-Jewish ones or pro-Israel ones. Like he's not including CARE, which I showed had millions more dollars than these other groups that he showed in the pro-Palestine camp. Hillel International is also like international, so that's not super fair if we're just comparing for United States. And the American Jewish community also is not just like a college-based group. They're much more broad than that. And those both seem to be the highest numbers in that little table. I'm not going to argue that pro-Palestine groups are probably more grassroots and just like a bunch of rowdy college students, whereas the pro-Israel ones might be a bit more organized with like old Jewish boomer funders and stuff. But I really don't think this is a great comparison. This is very apples to oranges.
6 pro-Israel groups, we see the pro-Israel groups have 34 times the funding and 31 times the membership figures. Now, many of you may be saying that this isn't a fair comparison because groups like Hillel and Chabad don't exclusively support pro-Israel politics on campus, while SJP does exclusively focus on Palestine. I said these comparisons wouldn't be apples to apples because that's just not how reality works. The reason, however, that this comparison is relevant is that these Jewish groups are the ones which counter-protest SJP and lobby both the administrations of the schools as well as the federal government to take actions against them. So it does effectively illustrate the power differential that we're dealing with. And if we as Americans are genuinely concerned about a foreign country having influence over U.S. higher education, let's deal with the log in our eye before the speck that is Qatar. And
so he kind of accepts that it's not a perfect comparison, but I would even go further in saying that this has nothing to do with Israel per se funding these groups. It's just rich American Jews funding them. And they like Israel, obviously, and they want students to be pro-Israel and stuff, so that's why they're funding. And they probably do think that there's like a rise in anti-Semitism and all this stuff. I mean, I don't even really care about that personally. I just think that there's more attention given to Jews and like Israel in general, so it's going to freak out old Jewish people. But these old Jewish people, a lot of them are just American Jews who have money and fund stuff that they like giving to colleges and whatnot. I know these white nationalist types might think that's like a foreign entity, but they're American citizens. They're not from a foreign country. And I hate to say it, but AIPAC as well. Everyone wants to say they're like a foreign lobby, but they're just really not. I mean, you can get into dual loyalty stuff, but you can't really say they're just like foreigners.
Enjoys isn't even the result of an explicit effort, but is rather simply a result of the fact that we have a significant minority Jewish population in the U.S., and one which is extremely overrepresented on our campuses. Take professors, for instance. While no definitive studies exist in the question, one Harvard professor in 1971 suggested that 25% of the faculty at that university were Jewish, while a more recent study suggests that 21% of baby boomer academics are Jewish, although that number has declined significantly for younger generations.
How many of these Jewish professors are pro-Israel, though? I mean, most people get a sense that college professors are more liberal, more on the left. I don't have any like specific study on this or whatever, but I'm sure most Jewish professors on college campuses aren't just like rabid Zionists. It's probably like pretty much the same as any other population. And I would even go to suggest that maybe they're like more pro-Palestine because they're Jewish and have to like have this need to push back against Israel. I have no hard data on this. I only have like anecdotes. But again, his whole point shouldn't be like Jews versus Qataris. That doesn't make sense. It should be Israelis versus Qataris if we're going to go down that route. And I mean, US colleges aren't like filled with Israeli professors. Obviously, they're filled with Jewish professors. Jews in education have a long history. I'm not going to go into that. I did do a review of Ron Unz's article on Jews at Harvard, so you can look at that. But I mean, that's only tangentially related. But anyways, I don't think this is a very interesting point.
Students at elite universities are also disproportionately Jewish. While estimates vary, I'll refer to this chart on ivycoach.com, which seems to represent a good average of the figures that I came across. You can see that at Columbia and Brown, Jewish students account for over 20% of undergraduates, and they are at least significantly overrepresented in every other Ivy League school. Additionally, the Hillel organization tracks the percentage of Jewish students at non-Ivy League schools, with Tulane, CUNY Brooklyn, Queens College, and George Washington University having from 27 to 44% Jewish students, while even some very large schools like the University of Florida still have a disproportionate percentage of Jewish students at 19%.
Okay, doesn't this just vindicate all of the Jewish funding that he's been talking about thus far? If there is a high proportion of Jewish students on college campuses, then shouldn't these Jewish organizations on campus have the money and presence to match that population size? I don't really get the argument here either. If Jews are overrepresented on campus and they're like a big chunk of the population, then okay, there's going to be a lot of Jewish groups there and Jewish like organizations. I just don't yeah, of course, that is correct. And explains the big mystery of why Jewish groups have funding on campuses, because there are Jews that fund it. There's no big conspiracy here. It doesn't mean Jews run the campuses, it just means there are Jews on campus and they have organizations that cater to Jews. I don't know, I don't mean to laugh so much, but I mean, it's just ridiculous. Like, it's very simple logic here.
And lastly, of course, it is well known that the presidents of elite universities for several decades now have been disproportionately Jewish. Now, believe it or not, I'm not even saying that any of this is inherently a problem. I only point out this overrepresentation of Jewish individuals at the risk of sounding like a conservative saying, imagine if the situation were reversed. Because if the situation were reversed, if Qatari students dominated campuses, if the majority of Ivy League presidents were Qatari, if a large percentage of the faculty were Qatari, many interested parties would have already lashed out against the state of affairs. And in all reality, it probably would have been changed. They would simply not have abided by this level of Qatari influence. So despite the fact that pointing out hypocrisy is famously a pointless endeavor, there it is.
I've used this argument before that complaining about Jewish overrepresentation among university professors or leadership is kind of akin to complaining there's not enough black people or like Hispanic people involved in these same positions. If Jews are 2% of the population, which I don't even accept that number really, but let's just go with it, then shouldn't they only be 2% of the leadership roles or university professors? That's like saying, they're 15% of college professors should be Hispanic and 13% should be black. This makes no sense. It's really dumb, especially coming from so-called white nationalists or someone akin to that space. It's really no different than complaining that universities are too white in general, or, every CEO is a white person. And you can actually see, I'm not going to bring up Qataris, because again, Qataris are like 3 million people, like in their own country. I mean, there's like barely any Qataris in existence. I think the Qatari population is actually like 1 million of like just the Arabs, and the country has 3 million, but they're like foreigners. I don't even really remember or care. It's a small country. It doesn't matter. The fact is, Gulf state Arabs and Arabs in general aren't going to be represented among university professors because that's not really their cultural thing. They're oil-rich people. They're not going to become like university professors in countries they don't even live in, unlike Jewish Americans. But you could see Asians overrepresented in colleges. You could see Indians overrepresented in CEOs. Now, you can all say this is like nepotism and they're all like idiots and it's really unfair or something. I mean, I think that's just coping. But yeah, I've dealt with this argument before, and it's just, unironically, it's woke right. The kind of stuff that James Lindsay talks about. It's kind of funny. They would poo-poo that idea, and they'd say it's like really, stupid, and they're like above that kind of thinking. But no, it's actually totally accurate.
Donations to the school are extremely valuable, and the combined donations from both the past and the present pay for about half of the school's yearly budget. Ever since the October 2023 attack of Israel by Hamas militants and the resultant pro-Palestinian demonstrations on these campuses, there's been a widespread campaign by many of the most prominent donors to elite universities to suspend their donations until the universities take more definitive actions to combat the alleged anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment on their campuses. Examples of donors who are participating in this boycott include Kenneth Griffin, a senior fellow of the Harvard Corporation, who demanded that the university come out strongly in defense of Israel. Until such a time, he would pause his donations to the university. Griffin has donated more than $500 million lifetime to Harvard, including a $300 million gift made in 2023. Griffin has also called for a public blacklist to be made of students who have engaged in anti-Israel protests, so employers can know who not to hire.
I just want to point out that this Ken Griffin guy is not Jewish, and part of his response to Harvard is also like to be anti-DEI, which I'll talk about later too, under like Trump's whole Project 2025. But yeah, it just seems like Leather Apron Club, he has a pretty like wide, generic pool of people to choose from who he would just classify as like pro-Israel influence, pro-Jewish influence on college campuses, or just in American life in general. But when it comes to Qatar, he is only focused on the Qataris, which isn't really a fair comparison, again, because a more fair comparison would be Israelis versus Qataris.
Rowan, CEO of Apollo Management, pulled his own funding, which has likely totaled in the tens of millions of dollars to UPenn, and publicly called for other donors to do the same, again citing anti-Semitism. Leslie Wexner's Wexner Foundation cut ties with Harvard in 2023 over the same issue. John Huntsman Jr., who donates tens of millions to UPenn, has suspended his payments.
John Huntsman Jr. is also not Jewish. He's Mormon, I believe. And this just goes to show that a lot of Americans, regardless of being Jewish or not, still like Israel. I mean, that's starting to change, but it's still a fact. And yeah, people were pretty freaked out by the October 7th attacks, and it just caused a lot of backlash. All this is proving is that there are white American Christians who like Israel, so.
His payments. David Magarin diverted his donations from UPenn and instead gave $1 million donations each to 4 Israeli universities. Russell Berry, over $90 million in lifetime funding to Columbia, pulled his funding. Avi Kaner explicitly redirected his funding to Columbia instead to Columbia's Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies and urged other donors to do the same. Robert Kraft pulled his own funding to Columbia. Kraft also donates millions to groups like AIPAC, the Israel Project, and Stand With Us, all pro-Israel groups, as well as paying $100 million to create the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism. Aydin Ofer, an Israeli billionaire, stepped down from the board of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and halted all donations he was making to the school.
So yeah, overall, I don't have too much of an issue with him pointing this kind of stuff out, but I do think there's a difference between actively funding an institution to follow what you want them to do versus withdrawing funding from an institution when they do something that you don't like that they're doing, if that makes sense. I'm not going to harp on this too much. I think the points are clear, but yeah, anyway, moving forward.
And this is before we bring into question the other major source of funding for these universities, the federal government. Federal funding makes up a very large chunk of most universities' budgets, around 11% of Harvard's, for instance. The second Trump administration has already canceled billions of dollars in multi-year contracts and grants between the federal government and several elite universities, and has threatened a total of 60 universities with similar funding cuts. All of this done under the administration's Joint Task Force to Combat Anti-Semitism. The cuts that have already taken effect include $650 million in research grants to Columbia, $790 million from Northwestern, $210 million from Princeton, $510 million stripped from Brown, $1 billion from Cornell, and the university hit worst by these cuts was Harvard, which has already had $2.4 billion in federal funding removed, with a total of $9 billion still officially under review.
So I totally disagree with the administration cutting any funds due to any campus protests. I totally believe in free speech for all the whatever pro-Palestinian people. I do just want to say that I think much of the funding cuts to universities is not only happening to universities with large pro-Palestinian protests, they're happening across the board, even more so with public institutions. If you look at this website, it tracks it all. Trump, even before the Hamas attacks, in his Project 2025 manifesto, whatever you want to call it, but whatever, the people who planned it out wanted to defund from universities, either for, quote unquote woke stuff, DEI stuff, even stuff dealing with China. There was many reasons why they wanted to pull funding from the university system, and we're seeing it across the board regardless of Palestine protests or not. I don't think every college has like a super robust Palestine protest. I don't think that's like a big enough reason to cut all this funding. So I don't think it's the main reason. I think it's just the one that makes a lot of headlines. And it just kind of falls in line with his previous plan of cutting funding regardless. So that's all I would say about that, is that these universities that he's cutting funding from, they either have pro-Palestine protests and did the quote-unquote like DEI stuff, and he's already cutting funding just in general, and it is across the board regardless of large Palestine encampments and whatnot.
Qatar. And beyond mere financial damages, numerous other punitive actions have been taken against these universities. To discuss just a few, residents from UPenn, Harvard, Columbia, Cornell, and a couple other schools besides were all forced out over the issue of anti-Semitism over the past few years.
I do just want to point out that Martha Pollack is Jewish, so that should be said. But also, and more importantly, for each of these individuals, like, yes, pro-Israeli individuals and groups called for these people to either resign or to adjust their views or their institution's views on the conflict to like denounce Hamas, whatnot. But they also got flack from the pro-Palestinian groups on campus as well. Surprisingly, the one who got the most flack from pro-Palestinian groups was the Muslim one, Manoush Shafiq, and she got a lot of flack because she brought in the NYPD to disrupt the protests that were going on in the encampments. So a lot of pro-Palestinian groups called for her to resign. I'm not saying like pro-Israel people were happy with her either, but it was obviously like the pressure from both groups and just the general atmosphere at the time that led to a lot of these people resigning. Also, I'm surprised he doesn't bring up Christopher Rufo when he brings up Claudine Gay. Everyone knows that Claudine Gay had a big plagiarism scandal and that she was kind of seen as this diversity hire that was super pro-DEI. And Christopher Rufo, he was this conservative dude, I guess he's still around, that is like very against critical race theory and DEI and all that. So he kind of led the charge against Claudine Gay. And obviously he used like the October 7th stuff to inflame that. But his main goal was to fight against DEI and stuff. Like, he's not Jewish. I don't think he's like, Israel is not his main topic or anything. So yeah, I would say none of these presidents like had either side super on their side, as it were.
In some instances, the fact that these resignations were forced over the issue of anti-Semitism was quite overt, like in 2023, when UPenn board chair Scott Bach was replaced with interim chair Julie Platt, who also happens to serve as the chair of the Jewish Federations of North America.
Keyword here being interim. She was shortly replaced by some Indian dude named Ramanan Raghavandran, so that's that. I don't see the point in calling her out for being Jewish when he didn't do so for Martha Pollack and when she's not even in that position anymore, so.
To January 29th, 2025, when Trump signed Executive Order 14188, titled Additional Measures to Combat Anti-Semitism. This order is what launched the investigations mentioned above and put the billions of dollars in federal funding up for review. This executive order also sought to revoke the visas of students who allegedly supported Hamas, and it did so with more than 1,000, many of whom are still caught up in legal challenges. So with all this, you can hopefully start to see just how much of a full court press there has been by this lobby on our education system.
So that makes sense. I'm not going to argue against it too much. I still think at the end of the day, the cuts to colleges and universities, the revoking of student visas for people who are pro-Hamas or sympathetic, whatever. I think it still falls in line with Trump's greater plan to just be generally like anti-immigration, anti-student visas, anti-university funding, whatever. So to me, it's not really so much the Jews like have this like firm control of Trump, and he really wants to let these kids come in who are like pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine, but the Jews won't let them. It's more just like, yeah, he sees the alignment, the shared goal, if you will, of not letting these students come over. He's also revoked student visas for other people, like irregardless of Palestine and Israel. And I just see it as one way that the U.S. kind of sees Israel as an alignment with its own goals, which we'll get into later, probably by the end of this video. Anyways, from here, I'm going to skip around to parts that I just want to respond to, so let's just get into that. Just to give context for this next clip, he's discussing lobbying efforts from Qatar and also Saudi Arabia and UAE and comparing them.
In a nutshell, the Arab League wanted Qatar to stop funding the Muslim Brotherhood, shut down Al Jazeera, and importantly, reduce or sever its ties with Iran. In addition to their blockade, members of the Arab League also launched huge new lobbying campaigns in the US meant to denigrate and further isolate Qatar. These efforts were led primarily by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The UAE alone doubled their lobbying spend from 2016 to 2017, the majority of this increase being directed at the Qatari question. From 2015 to 2017, the Saudis went from working with 25 foreign agents to 145, and also more than doubled their total lobbying spend from 2016 to 2018. The Saudis paid several think tanks to produce works critical of Qatar, including the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
So yeah, I have no problem with him discussing Saudi and UAE lobbying in the US. And I mean, I totally agree that Saudi Arabia is a far more important country than Qatar in the US. We have a much longer history with them. I've written a whole article on this, so you can check that out. So I totally agree here. And just something that I'll throw in that, like he kind of mentioned with Iran, I mean, a big reason why we got out of the Iran deal was because of Saudi pressure as well. I'm not saying Israel didn't pressure, and he'll get into Israel later, but definitely Saudi Arabia played a role in that as well.
By comparing it to the Israel lobby. Why don't we go through just a few examples of how they influence U.S. politicians? Again, won't be able to hit even a fraction of the whole here. A comprehensive breakdown of the full scope of the Israel lobby would have to be another standalone video. I'll try to hit just the highlights, stopping only when it's been proven beyond the shadow of a doubt just how more influential this group is. In terms of sheer budget, Open Secrets claims that Israel has spent $192 million lobbying the United States since 2017. Qatar in the same period has spent $249 million, or about 30% more. Famously, however, much of the pro-Israel lobbying that goes on in the United States is not registered under FARA. The website Track APAC noted this and made a great effort to compile a list of every dollar spent on pro-Israel lobbying which went unregistered. Their conclusion was that Israel's lobbying spend is not slightly below Qatar's, but actually around 3 times higher, at $635 million since 2017.
So just to dumb it down, FARA means foreign and non-FARA means like domestic. So organizations like APAC. Now I looked at the Track APAC data and I understand where they're coming from. I'll just do a screenshot real quick to show what I'm looking at. So they're basically just adding up all of the domestic campaign spending that was spent like from pro-Israel groups or individuals in the United States itself from like US citizens. I highlighted the Adelsons because those are like the two big funders of Trump that were like Jewish and pro-Israel. And then with APAC and its like other umbrella organization, you can start to see where like the hundreds of millions of dollars are coming in. Now, again, I think it's a weird apples and oranges comparison because Qatar is just one small Gulf Arab country. And like I said previously, there's like hundreds of thousands of actual Qatari Arabs in general. There's not like millions like there are Jews in America. And while the Adelsons did give Trump a lot of money, I mean, there were other people who gave more money to Trump, not for Israel-related things, like Elon Musk, for example. I'm not saying their donations weren't, like, considerable, but, you know, it's all relative. And I do just want to point out that nowhere in this video, I don't think Leather Apron Club brings up the $400 million Qatari jet donation that Qatar just gave to Trump. Now, they did that in 2025, so maybe that's, like, why it's not, you know, incorporated into this graph or whatever. But okay, so the Adelsons gave, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars to Trump, but I just don't see why Qatar giving a $400 million value gift essentially to Trump doesn't also, I mean, I don't know, wouldn't that essentially just like put both Israel and Qatar on balance as equal in terms of like money contributions, in terms of like, you know, lobbying as it were? If we're going to go down this route of like, okay, campaign contributions from the Adelsons, that's all part of like Israel. Which, I mean, I understand, like, yeah, they're Jewish, American, Zionists. I think they're dual citizens, I don't even know. But, and obviously, Sheldon is dead. But, okay, so if we take their contributions, then why wouldn't Qatar giving a $400 million gift to Trump also be considered, like, a bribe or some kind of, like, funding? I mean, I don't know. To me, it makes sense, and it would, like, honestly equalize out these, in terms of just, like, straight up the figures. But I don't think anywhere in this video he mentions that. I mean, I think it's important to bring that up. He talks a little bit more about this and brings up like Kufi and the Jewish National Fund, which are more like private charities. I'm not super interested in that. He kind of just mentions them as possible things to take into account. But anyway, I'm going to move on to his tackling the subject of military aid and militarism in general.
So starting with arms deals, which the Free Press says Qatar has spent $30 billion on. Putting aside questions of whether this is purely money spent to influence the United States and not just a practical measure because they want weapons, let's examine the reality. It is true, Qatar has made several high-value transactions with the U.S. for military equipment. According to the White House, they are our 12th largest foreign military sales partner. In fact, after Trump's recent visit to Qatar in May of this year, there's been another $42 billion weapons agreement signed. So the total should really be $72 billion. Mind you, that is $72 billion that Qatar has given to us. Let's compare that figure to Israel. Since its creation in 1948, the U.S. has given Israel $251 billion in inflation-adjusted dollars in military aid, or $318 billion in total aid. There is currently a 10-year memorandum of understanding through 2028, which sees the U.S. giving Israel $3.8 billion a year in further military aid. Additionally, it has been written into law that the U.S. shall ensure that Israel maintains what is called a qualitative military edge over other countries in the region.
I'll talk more about the strategic reasons why we have this military aid situation with Israel and how that came about, especially during the Cold War when Israel post-67 war proved itself to be kind of like a worthy proxy in its battles with proxies of the Soviet Union and the Middle East, such as like Egypt and Syria, how it helped give us intel on Soviet weaponry, etc. But also, I just want to say that the qualitative military edge that we kind of like ensure Israel has in the Middle East, in fact, like pushes and drives an arms sales like race, an arms race in the region, which helps our military industrial complex, essentially. I hate to use that word, but that's really what it is. And all of the military aid to Israel is essentially a subsidy to the arms industry in the United States. I would recommend reading Stephen Zunes on this. He's written a lot about this. But yeah, I mean, we are essentially subsidizing our arms industry and thereby subsidizing Israel's military, but it serves a purpose of not only arming a proxy in the region, but also it fuels an arms race, which just gives us more cash, like from these Gulf states, like Qatar here. So his example, it kind of goes hand in hand that these Gulf states want the same weaponry that Israel has, so they just end up buying similar, usually not up to the exact like standard that Israel has, but like 1 degree lower than what Israel has, and like paying us billions of dollars. So we still overall like make out pretty well with the whole situation.
Provided Israel extensive air and naval support in the region since October 2023, shooting down Iranian drones and missiles. Over the same time period, the U.S. has flown 33% of the recon flights providing intel to Israel, and we have made an impressive display of force via the presence of our warships and troops staged in the area, which essentially represents a blank check of wartime support worth billions more at least. Military support for Israel is, of course, another area in which I've said a bunch of times now, I could go on for hours to discuss the service. The point is, yes, Qatar paid us $72 billion in cash, and their own cash, mind you. Maybe that arrangement has its own problems. I have problems with it myself. But whatever the case may be, we're talking about either getting $72 billion or losing at least $251 billion, along with countless billions more in weapons and support, not to mention the risking of American lives. So yes, these arms deals obviously involve us more deeply with Qatar, but there are far worse alternatives. Continue.
Okay, a lot to go over there. What I would say is that in terms of like U.S. military presence shooting down Iranian drones and missiles and stuff, and like combating the Houthis, even though we've actually like made peace with them for now at least, but regardless, I would just say that showing U.S. military force and power is kind of a goal and in and of itself. It shows that the U.S. military establishment still has the capabilities and power that it kind of portrays itself to have. And I think it just further like goes into establishing ourselves as like a world hegemon and even getting these arms deals that he's saying is a good thing. People could say that's a stretch, but I don't know. I don't think it's really that crazy to like shoot down missiles from like U.S. naval ships or whatever, or from like THAAD missile launchers or something like that. It's really like no one is really at risk. Like he says U.S. soldiers are at risk. I mean, ironically, and he's going to bring this up, the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, but ironically, like, wouldn't our U.S. soldiers be at risk in these foreign bases that we do spend billions of dollars on? I mean, we spend billions on our bases in Japan, South Korea, Europe every year, and I mean, technically that's putting our soldiers at risk. I mean, not like really, but they're in a foreign country. And while he's about to say that Qatar spends money on the Al Udeid Air Base, it's not like we're making a profit off of that base, as it were. I mean, we still have to like pay our troops to be there and stuff. And I just want to say that, I mean, Israel, like we give them aid and military aid and stuff, as I've said, to like showcase our weapons, but also Israel like helps to test out our weaponry and oftentimes will improve upon it or like make certain adjustments to it that we benefit from. Defense contractors, speaking of lobbying, lobbied for the passing of that bill because it had aid for not only Israel but Ukraine during their wartime efforts. And again, it's just like the same thing to help the U.S. arms industry, call it the military industrial complex, whatever. It obviously benefits them, and that is, benefiting U.S. companies. I'm not saying it's like ideal or moral or anything, but a Leather Apron Club is saying, okay, we're making money off of these arms sales to Qatar, so okay, I mean, that's what these arms industries are lobbying for, that they want to give aid to Israel because it's a subsidy for them, and then in turn it creates more sales in general. And the reason we have all these US bases in the Middle East anyway is because all of these Gulf states don't have like real militaries. They kind of have to rely on us to protect them. That's what happened in the Gulf War One. At least Israel uses its own troops and army to do its thing in the Middle East. I'm not saying everything they do is like right or just or whatever. Although they've frankly taken out a bunch of hostile groups to the United States in the region, like Hezbollah, like IRGC officials, etc. And then one can argue, oh, those groups only hate the US because of Israel and the support that the US gives to Israel. I would argue against that, but regardless, Israel fights on its own pretty frequently with US weapons and aid, but they still do it on their own, and like their soldiers are dying, not ours, and have severely weakened Iran, so much to the point that we were able to like bomb their nuclear bunkers without like any kind of like hint of threat. And they're currently taking out the Houthis, which the Houthis have been a problem in the past for us. It's not just been this like post-October 7th thing. They've been a thorn in our side for a while. We helped Saudi Arabia essentially bomb the hell out of Yemen. People say that our helping Israel in Gaza is like a genocide, like aiding and abetting genocide. I mean, if you use that same methodology and standard, I would say we were doing the same thing with Saudi, but we have our own reasons to do these things. So a lot there, I'll just let him carry on.
Moving on the theme of military involvement, the Free Press article tells us that Qatar has invested $8 billion in the Al Udeid Air Base as part of their influence campaign. The Al Udeid Air Base is located in Doha and hosts the Qatari Air Force alongside 11,000 United States Air Force service members. This makes it the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East, and it is considered an invaluable part of U.S. Central Command, from which countless attacks have been launched against various Middle Eastern countries over the past 2.5 decades, most notably against Iraq. Now, the reason the Free Press gets to claim that Qatar has spent $8 billion on this air base is because they have paid for the base in its entirety. The initial cost of construction was over $1 billion in the 90s, when Qatar ostensibly was building the base for use by their Air Force. Although critics point out that certain features in the base's design were only really usable by U.S. forces and didn't make sense for the Qataris, suggesting an attempt to attract the U.S. from the start. Since the base was offered up for U.S. use in the year 2000, Qatar has indeed spent an additional $7 billion on maintaining and significantly expanding the base. The U.S. has contributed as well, paying a few $100 million for expansions to the base over the years, as well as of course paying for the troops and equipment. But easily over 90% of the base has been paid for and maintained by Qatar. In addition to the money already spent, a recent statement of intent has been made to invest more than $38 billion into the Al Udeid Air Base in the coming decades. Now, as to why Qatar lets the U.S. use their air base, obviously they're not doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. They clearly think they're benefiting. First, it is ultimately their base, so any improvements and expansions are theirs. But secondly, and far more importantly, hosting the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East is a great deterrent to any potential aggression from regional rivals, most notably the Saudis. So while Qatar, of course, benefits from having the U.S. there, the U.S. benefits greatly as well, making for what is by all accounts a mutually beneficial relationship. Qatar's hosting of this base helps in other ways as well.
I just want to say I have no idea how we benefit from protecting Qatar from Saudi Arabia, which is also our ally in the region. Like, how does the U.S. benefit from that necessarily? That's just protecting Qatar, which is fine. I mean, I don't believe Saudi should just like go and invade them. And it's probably best overall in terms of like keeping regional stability. But isn't that the whole case that like why we're there in general and like why we don't want Israel and Iran, for example, to like totally go out on an all-out war effort? So we like put a stop to that and like shot down missiles. You could say the same thing, that we just didn't want that to escalate into something greater than it already was for regional stability purposes. So I just don't see the difference here, except that like we obviously didn't like intercept any Saudi missiles or anything, but that was never going to happen anyway. So yeah, I thought these kind of guys were like bring home the troops kind of people, but it seems like he wants to make an excuse for Qatar here. I don't know. I don't really understand it. We're still spending money there and having our troops there. I understand it from like a U.S. global hegemon kind of reasoning, but not just for like but these guys generally don't align with that and are more like isolationists, so I don't really get what's going on here.
Most notably in 2021, during the hectic U.S. evacuation from Afghanistan, Qatar facilitated the movement of tens of thousands from Kabul airport and provided temporary housing to more than 58,000 Afghans, a role for which they received ample praise from the United States. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin conveyed that the evacuation would not have been possible without Qatari aid. The Israeli comparison to Al Udeid Air Base here is tough, as despite our close military cooperation and the hundreds of billions of dollars we provide them in military aid, Israel hosts no U.S. military bases. Now, we do have some limited military presence in Israel, most notably via the War Reserve's Stock Allies Israel Agreement, a program which maintains 6 stockpiles of weapons, vehicles, missiles, and medical supplies. These stockpiles are ostensibly for use by U.S. personnel in the region, but they often get used by Israeli troops instead, a cost which the U.S. eats as part of our military support package for Israel. As for the aid in the evacuation from Afghanistan, Israel played only a very small role, primarily via NGOs, and then only helping to evacuate around 200 or so people. The largest effort was carried out by one such NGO, Israel Aid, which helped 167 Afghan nationals out of the country. The focus was to aid particularly vulnerable Afghans, including judges, athletes, and journalists, almost all of whom, rather than allowing them to live in Israel, they eventually resettled in other Western countries, like Canada, France, and Switzerland. So,
real quick again, the stockpile depot in Israel did kind of help us out when we had to send arms to Ukraine, but eventually that kind of like got muddied up because Israel got embroiled in its own wars. So that's that. I will say it's kind of ironic that he's saying, oh, like Qatar helped Afghani refugees get out of Afghanistan and go to Qatar, but they didn't stay in Qatar. They ended up going to the West as well. So he's like highlighting this Israel aid, like getting like, I don't know, like 100 to 200 people evacuated from Afghanistan to go to the West. I mean, how is it bad when Israel does it, but it's like better when Qatar does it in like in greater numbers?
Despite being our greatest ally, Israel is largely a drain on us militarily, only ever taking rather than providing any material support, and showing an unwillingness to help us even when we are put into dire situations. Again, Qatar is not hosting space because they are kind-hearted. They want a U.S. military presence in their country, and they love being in our good graces. But you can't deny that at the end of the day, they are actually providing us with something, while Israel only takes. Moving on.
Israel only takes and never provides any material benefit to the U.S. This doesn't make any sense. Why would we have started to give Israel military aid in the first place if they didn't offer us anything? Now, these people will say, oh, some rich Jew like lobbied the president back in the day or something. That's total nonsense. Obviously, we saw them as like a Cold War proxy and tool against the Soviet Union, as I've said. There are various like presidents and other political figures who have said as much, that Israel is basically a good tool in the Middle East, a good proxy. They help us with R&D on weaponry, with intel on, back in the day, on Soviet weaponry. And the famous Khrushchev speech apparently was leaked to the West from Soviet dissident Jews who went to Israel as well. And that was like another tool we used for espionage against the Soviet Union. Then after the Cold War, they were still helpful in intel on like Islamist movements and hostile Arab nations in the region as well. And while, for instance, they didn't help out in the first Gulf War, they technically wanted to, and they only stopped because President Bush at the time didn't want them to join the coalition against Saddam because it would piss off the other Arabs in the coalition. And frankly, that's the main reason why Israeli troops don't necessarily help out the US in the region that much, because other Muslims just like don't want to see a bunch of Jews like fighting with them or in their lands. And there even has to be like special assignments for Jews in the US Army because of this, who get deployed to the Middle East. But they still help in weakening hostile regimes. They did this with Saddam pre-Gulf War I by bombing one of his nuclear reactors. They also did the same thing against Assad. Now, I don't really have a strong opinion on Assad or anything. I mean, he's not in power anymore, but he was still generally a hostile actor in the region against U.S. interests. He was aligned with Iran, who is against U.S. interests. And you can't really say, oh, that's because the U.S. is aligned with Israel, because when Iran and the U.S. had a good relationship, that was also when the U.S. and Israel had a good relationship. I mean, they were pretty buddy-buddy, and Israel even helped Iran back in the day. So yeah, a lot of Israeli military efforts have basically just been used from the U.S. perspective as kind of like a proxy war tool against the Soviet Union, and even post-Cold War helped out in intel and other things. All the leftists, like thinkers, agree with this take. It's only like right-wingers who think that somehow Israel is just like this parasitic entity, but that's just the fallacy of like the tail wagging the dog. That's just not how it goes. And yeah, I'm just going to skip ahead to go into some trade and investment type stuff that he talks about.
Including a significant but undisclosed investment into XAI. And not included in this $30 billion are figures from a recent commitment from May of this year between Qatar and the United States to generate an economic exchange worth at least $1.2 trillion and economic deals worth more than $243.5 billion. That $1.2 trillion figure represents a projected amount of trade to hopefully be realized over several decades, while the $243.5 billion represents the value of agreements and contracts already made. So we'll focus on that figure. And even so, not all of that $243.5 billion would be considered a Qatari business investment, but much of it would, including a $96 billion agreement to acquire 210 American-made Boeing 787 Dreamliners and 777X aircrafts, a historically large order for Boeing. It also includes 30 contracts won by Parsons, an American technology-focused defense and intelligence company valued at up to $97 billion. Suffice it to say, with this recent announcement, Qatar is set to massively increase its trade and therefore integration with the United States. Granted, many of these contracts may not fully materialize, and the $1.2 trillion in particular is a very optimistic projection, coming from an administration which has been known to throw out sometimes wild economic figures. But even so, let's assume that all of these contracts are paid out in full over the coming decades. How big of a trading partner would that make Qatar? Well, let's start by looking at our trade standing with Qatar right now, before these new deals are paid out. You can see that Qatar is a very small trading partner with the US, doing $5.6 billion in trade in 2024. This wouldn't even put them in the top 50 largest trading partner countries, being 55th largest in terms of exports and 65th in terms of imports, according to census.gov. Let's try our best to factor in these new contracts into this calculation. Now, the time frame for the various contracts in that $243 billion isn't specified, but will likely take place over 20 or so years, which would add $12.15 billion in trade a year between the US and Qatar. The plan is to increase economic investment as well, beyond just what has already been agreed upon. So let's be generous and double that figure to an additional $24.3 billion yearly. This would put Qatari trade with the US around $29 billion yearly, a huge increase and just enough to crack the top 30 largest trading partners. Yet they would still be below our 2024 trade with Israel, which was around $37 billion. This estimate, which is already generous, also assumes that trade with every other country over the next 20 years will neither increase nor decrease, which is of course not going to happen. So even with as much as a 5 times increase, Qatar still does less trade with the US than Israel. I'll once again reiterate the thesis. If it's a problem when Qatar does it, it's a problem when anyone does it. And again, I don't even think that trade is a bad thing, but the free press argues that it is, so we're treating it as such. What I do think is bad, though, is special treatment in trade, like the US-Israel Free Trade Agreement, which we've maintained since 1985, or the various loan guarantees that the US has maintained for Israel, which essentially amounts to co-signing on all of their loans. In total, these have covered tens of billions of dollars, and since 2006, we have maintained $3.8 billion in guarantees for them.
Just real quick on this, for the free trade agreement and the loan guarantees, this isn't like just a Israel-specific thing. There are other countries that have this, including countries in the Middle East. And I'm pretty sure as of right now, the US has tariffs put on Israeli goods, but not vice versa. Just throwing that out there. I don't think either point is like really that powerful, but whatever. And just to add to the like investment thing and like how a lot of countries throw around big numbers, if we're supposed to believe that Qatar is going to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the US economy, I mean, should we believe the recent statement from Zuckerberg that, oh, Meta is going to put in $600 billion into the US economy, and that means some Jew is just giving us $600 billion? Like, that's not how these things work. I'm not suggesting that that's how he's thinking, but like, people just see these big numbers and then like he said, Leather Apron Club says in a video, like they just think it's like such a big deal, but it's really not, and people do like lie and just like make up numbers like Zuckerberg did. So that's basically what the Qataris and the Saudis are doing as well. It's basically just to stroke Trump's ego. I'm sure though that like there is some investments going on and like it's a good thing, but I'm just saying that it's kind of like, a lot of it is like pie in the sky stuff. Anyways, I'm just gonna skip to the conclusion.
So now to wrap this whole video up, what exactly can we say about Qatari influence? Well, a few things. They have spent billions of dollars in their relationship with us. They've spent tens of millions on lobbying efforts alone, and our relationship with them seems to be deepening, with billions more in trade planned in the coming decades. It is undeniable that they are operating a campaign of creeping soft influence in the United States as part of their larger ambition to cement themselves as a Middle Eastern regional mediator. And their policies of investment ruffle feathers, as this new money player makes classless purchases of gaudy properties and vanity projects. The Qatari lobby is real. But when given a fair comparison to other lobbies, it becomes clear that they are far from the most powerful or influential group operating within our politics. And it necessarily puts into question anyone discussing Qatar without giving at least equal airtime to the larger and more detrimental players, with Israel being the standout example. I'll add too that qualitatively, our relationship with Qatar seems to be far more fruitful than with the Israelis. We give Qatar's weapons and planes because they buy them for billions of dollars. They also host our most important military base in the entire Middle East in Al Udeid. And of course, Qatar only does these things with an eye to their own benefit. But frankly, that's how alliances work. So long as we stay aware of that fact and we continue to believe that our relationship is benefiting us, it's a good thing.
Yeah, so just to conclude, I mean, I would agree with most of what he says here, especially to that point that is the relationship good, and if it is, then it should be maintained. I would argue that the Israeli relationship, while pretty rocky, is still like beneficial to the US. The only people it pisses off is the Arab Street, which frankly the US has never cared about. That's why we support Arab dictators and Arab royal families and stuff. The US military industrial complex and our goals in the region, like we don't really care about the average civilian in these countries. That's why we help Saudi with their war on Yemen. That's why we don't care that the United Arab Emirates funds the war in Sudan, and that's why we ultimately don't really care about Israel and what they do in Gaza. So none of this is special. It doesn't require like a couple Jewish billionaires donating a couple $100 million to US politicians, and that's why we're still with Israel, and like it's such a negative relationship. Like no, there's a momentum to the relationship. There's strategic goals and military goals that are still benefited by that relationship. So yeah, I guess I'll just like list a couple books that I think are cool too, that kind of showcase this. I would check out Anthony Lowenstein's book, The Gaza Laboratory, and it's written by this like Australian Jewish liberal or whatever who is decrying like Israeli crimes in Gaza, whatever, I'll just call them crimes for the sake of argument. And basically the book is just like this quick little short book that goes over how Israel like basically helps and creates technologies that US empire wants to use, like drone technology or surveillance technology, and how it uses this technology and then they exports it to other players in the world, and it helps the US and trains the US in this. So this like left-wing guy is arguing that it's bad, obviously from like moral grounds, but from like a US supremacist view, it's like actually good. And it's funny because I've seen right-wingers use this book to like say that Israel sucks and is bad, but in the book it literally talks about how Israel helped apartheid South Africa and is like quote unquote racist. It's just kind of funny that the right-wingers like don't like it when it's literally what they talk about kind of. Another book I would recommend is The Arab Lobby by Mitchell Bard. It mainly talks about Saudi Arabia, which I do think Leather Apron Club, I mean, he wants to compare to Israel so much, but he only like very quickly brought up Saudi and UAE, but the Saudi lobby has been like played a huge role in the US as well in this region. So I would check out the Arab lobby and my Substack article on Saudi. Also check out my Substack article on Iran as well, because it covers some of this stuff as well. But yeah, I hope I got everything. Sometimes I want to do like a just like all in one take OBS review reaction video, but I don't know. I'm like fucking retarded when it comes to this tech stuff. So anyway, peace out. Thanks for watching.